Hello and welcome to another video of Sean's Check-In. To follow all of my videos, feel free to follow my Facebook page, Sean P. Daughtry, LICSW, or over on my YouTube channel, Sean D, Sean's Little Check-In or Sean's Check-In. So today I wanted to go into something I touched very briefly upon in my last video, and that's the concept of toxic relationships. I didn't really discuss that when I mentioned other terms that are talked about in the community at large that have the term toxic in front of them, such as toxic people and other stuff besides toxic relationships. So what I wanted to explain about how I understand toxic relationships and how I help people get out of toxic relationships or develop better relationships that are more and more reciprocal in their lives, including with themselves, is first it goes back to the concept of what is called in internal family systems, which is a form of therapy that I work out of, is the concept of emotional or psychological burdens. When those develop, from out of those, it's easy, if they're unresolved, for people who carry such burdens to maintain and develop toxic relationships just out of sheer old habit. So the concept of an emotional or psychological burden is basically such that it is through the development, the happening of difficult, painful experiences, often in childhood or early on in adulthood, one develops negative, toxic beliefs about themselves. And from there, attached to that are negative feeling states and negative thoughts that are all bundled together, called burdens, that facilitate one responding over and over again in the environment to stimuli that triggers off these burdens, if you will. So if something in childhood happens where, for example, a person is recurrently abused often by a parent or by someone in the school system when they started going to school, such as by a teacher or by other students where they were bullied or what have you. But anyway, these negative early lifetime experiences can become easily triggered again by anything in the environment that seems at all remotely associated with those experiences. And then it triggers off some negative thoughts and feeling states about oneself. And that's a main example that I can think of, if you will, an emotional or psychological burden. Again, burdens are developed by painful experiences that are never really resolved. These emotional burdens that any of us can easily carry to some extent or another, because the world is a difficult place and no family is perfect, and all parents to some extent or another make mistakes, as do teachers and other people around us. Anyway, these burdens that develop, these internal pain spots, if you will, which hold are again negative beliefs accompanied by negative feeling states and negative thoughts and imagery, even memories around these burdens. Those we carry along with us. And often, because life is ongoing and something that the environment around us is something we have to negotiate and deal with all the time, we often don't have time to process through and resolve these burdens. They just get stored away in back of us, in the back of our minds, and then they just come up activated or triggered, if you will, according to whatever is going on in our environment around us. So those are toxic experiences inside of us that result in these toxic beliefs, such as I'm not good enough, I don't deserve love. I mean, it just goes on, all these different toxic beliefs that can get internalized in us as human beings. And the feeling states, such as shame, especially guilt, maybe in the mix there, unresolved grief, fear, and also some unresolved anger. Those are common unresolved painful feelings that may be part of the comprise these emotional psychological burdens, if you will, that really are toxic unresolved experiences inside of us. That then leads us as human beings to varying degrees to replicate what we know. After all, what we grew up with is what's normal and what we know. And if that's untested and not questioned and released, we carry on experiencing and re-experiencing these burdens, and people therefore enter as adults, can enter to varying degrees unhealthy or toxic relationships with other people that repeat these toxic patterns of being given messages yet again, like they got in childhood, that they aren't very good enough, they don't deserve love, they should be punished, all these irrational, untrue, but toxic beliefs that get embedded in our neural networks. So toxic relationships then are predisposed to happen for people that come from toxic, if you will, experiences, toxic backgrounds, often as children of abusive and or neglectful parents. That's what I see a lot of when I work with people, but also people that have experienced difficulties, maybe not so much at home with their parents, but certainly in school, and the parents weren't very well equipped to help them navigate those difficulties in school. So they're left with old burdens, emotional burdens, if you will, inside them from what happened to them in school as children, where perhaps they were scapegoated or overlooked around help that they needed that they just didn't get, such as with learning challenges and what have you. There's also other environmental difficulties for children. Now, I don't see this very much in my practice, but I certainly know of children who are people of color who maybe had a good, stable home life, but their environment around them was hostile to them because they were significantly different within their community if they were, for example, a person of color. Same for people who were grew up gay or non-heterosexual or non-cisgendered, for that matter, too. So anyway, I work with people to release their toxic beliefs. First, by identifying them through taking a history and talking with them about their experiences. And then, as best as possible, if the client is ready for to do such rigorous, intense work, EMDR may be indicated, and they may be ready for that, which is called EMDR, by the way, stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I know I mentioned that once in a past video. So that kind of method helps to de-intensify significantly, and sometimes, and ideally down to 0 from a 10, for example, a negative belief, and the accompanying memories of the experience or experiences that instilled that negative belief, such as I'm not good enough, and as a negative belief, and the experiences that happened to instill that negative belief, that maybe one or more sets of experiences in childhood that brought on that belief because of messages they got from one or both parents or a number of people in their environment earlier in their lives, usually in childhood. So that's the first thing to do, is to detoxify and, i.e., remove or lessen as much as possible these internal emotional burdens that therefore give a person leeway and understanding, more clarity, if you will, that they've got more choices than they've been led to believe through having their negative beliefs they've been holding on to without even realizing they were. They've got more choices in relationships, that there are other kinds of healthier relationships to have than the ones they've been having in their lives, which may be relationships in which they are getting continuously abused, often more psychologically and verbally than necessarily physically, although that can comprise it too, such as in domestic violence situations. So sometimes then it's helping a person to leave some negative, awful, toxic relationship, if you will, where they've been getting abused. It may be with a spouse or an adult parent, since I work with just adults, or with a sibling, or maybe more than one negative, toxic relationship. And when I say toxic relationships, what do I mean by a toxic relationship? I mean a relationship between two or more people where ongoing harm is being done. And that's usually psychological, emotional harm. Although sometimes it can accompany, as I've mentioned before, that it can accompany physical harm as well. So I help people to understand that safety is their right and that they can lead safer lives than the lives they've been leading. Which of course means de-intensifying the negative belief that they don't even necessarily deserve a safe life, or that the world is such an unsafe place that there are no safe relationships to be had. And so I work on challenging that negative belief that's so distorted in them. And that may include doing some de-intensifying work with this method called EMDR. So that's how I work with helping people leave toxic relationships and develop better and better, more reciprocal relationships that are positive at their core, and full of mutual compassion and curiosity between themselves and the other party. That, for some people, is a big deal to get to, as they leave an old toxic pattern of being in negative, toxic relationships that may be intergenerational, in which their parents and people and their grandparents may have been caught up in, of these toxic relationships, of it being just a family tradition, so to speak. Helping get people out of that and into a more sense of choice, that they can have better treatment in the world, and there are other people out there who will be reciprocal with them and treat them well. That can be very much a sea change for some people who have never really known that in their lives. And that's at one big extreme. And then more in the middle of that, if you will, is people that carry some degree of toxic beliefs that have enough intensity in there that they have a mix of positive reciprocal relationships, but maybe more up close in their very close intimate life, such as with a spouse. They don't really have that's more of a mixed kind of relationship that contains a bit of a significant amount of toxicity. And that may involve a certain degree of dominance and submission, where perhaps they're submitting more to this dominating partner, or it's a struggle back and forth of dominance in some ways and submission happening back and forth, and there's no understanding of equality and a mid-ground of reciprocity, that's like very limited in the relationship. And just helping people navigate that and develop that more, possibly, if possible, within the relationship they're already in, which may be then indicated that if they get couples work, that the client and their partner can start to heal and have more and more of a reciprocal relationship within their marriage or union. Then that can happen, and that's wonderful. If that can't, then it's looked at about the possibility of separation and or even divorce, so that they can start anew in their lives with other people, in a more positive reciprocal way from the beginning, from an already more healed place. It just varies case by case. But I do understand that the more the world is full of reciprocal relationships between people, then the world is that much of a better place. So I hope I've done some clarification here about what comprises toxic relationships and the roots of them that tend to be emotional burdens people carrying themselves, and then bring into relationships with others. And that is, of course, a co-occurrence where two or more parties, each carrying their own emotional burdens, come together and maintain those emotional burdens that then look like toxic relationships, toxic exchanges of communication and feeling states that then keep getting activated, that are in there for each individual in the first place and then are reenacted again. So I do want to say too that certain forms of toxic relationships are unfortunately facilitated in much of the community at large, particularly around entitlement and incivility that goes with that. There is this sense of permission given by a lot of people in the public sphere for others to be allowed to be entitled if they're in positions of power or privilege, and which could include just their wealth or them being famous or some combination thereof, that they're given leeway to just be entitled and treat people around them in an uncivil way. And also even in the political sphere in terms of power, like lots of politicians being more and more entitled and uncivil. And that's a lot of toxic exchange, and where toxic relationships are a form of toxic relationships that are given this free leeway and pass by a large amount of the public that enable it and see those kinds of relationships as somehow glamorous and allowable. That's a whole other topic unto itself. I do want to say that it is well touched upon in this new book called Don't You Know Who I Am? By a psychologist, Ramani S. Durvasula, and she goes into how we're in an era of narcissism, entitlement, and incivility, and how therefore toxic relationships can continue on such a large scale, and she goes into how to stop being a part of that as much as possible. But again, that's another area of topic I could go into in another video, but at least I wanted to explain as best as possible the concept of toxic relationships and where they come from, and work that I do to help people not continue to be in them and to leave them if need be. And of course have better relationships with themselves. By unburdening yourself, you feel more and more better about yourself and come back to your core understanding and experience of your own self, which is inherently compassionate, curious, calm, and 5 other C's that you can look up online of the 8 qualities of self. Thank you for watching this video, and I will check in again sometime.